Iran made the most expensive strategic miscalculation in its modern military history, and the bill was not paid in sanctions, not in diplomatic humiliation, not in economic pressure applied over years of negotiation. It was paid in reinforced concrete, collapsed mountain tunnels, and the smoking ruins of weapons systems Iran spent decades and billions of dollars constructing specifically because it believed they were permanently beyond the reach of any bomb America could build. For weeks, the Islamic Republic had its hand wrapped around the throat of the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile corridor through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil and gas supply flows every single day, had been strangled nearly shut. Mines seeded across the water, drone swarms hunting. Every tanker that dared to move, anti-ship missiles buried so deep inside Iranian mountains that Tehran genuinely believed no weapon on earth could reach them. That belief is now a crater, multiple craters, and what just happened along that coastline did not just damage Iran's military capability, it permanently changed the strategic reality of this entire conflict in ways that cannot be undone. To understand why the GBU-72 strikes matter as much as they do, you first need to understand exactly how suffocating Iran's blockade had become, because the numbers are almost hard to believe. Before this conflict began, more than 100 vessels per day were transiting the Strait of Hormuz without incident: supertankers, liquefied natural gas carriers, container ships moving the energy that powers factories, hospitals, and homes across Asia, Europe, and beyond. By the time the ceasefire was announced, that number had collapsed to near zero. Iran had cut off more than 90% of normal traffic, roughly 10 million barrels of oil per day gone from global supply. Oil prices jumped sharply on every disruption. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO confirmed on April 9 that 230 fully loaded tankers were sitting motionless inside the Gulf with nowhere to go, held hostage by Iran's blockade. That is not an abstraction on a financial news ticker. That is your gas bill, your grocery bill, the cost of heating your home, multiplied across every country on earth connected to energy markets. Iran understood the math perfectly, and for weeks it was working. Iran's strategy was coldly logical, and it nearly succeeded. Hold the strait hostage long enough. Watch oil prices explode past $100 per barrel. Let the economic pain accumulate on Washington's allies, the Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Indians, until the political pressure on Trump becomes unbearable. Every single day the blockade held was another day of allied governments calling the White House demanding the corridor be reopened. Another day of global shipping insurance rates exploding, another day of supply chains seizing up. The Strait of Hormuz was Iran's trump card, its ultimate piece of leverage over not just America, but every nation on earth with an economy dependent on stable energy. There was only one problem with that strategy. Iran's trump card had a vulnerability it had fatally underestimated, and the United States had been quietly building the answer to that vulnerability for years. Here is what most coverage completely misses about Iran's coastal missile network, and it is the detail that makes everything that followed possible. These were not weapons sitting on open hilltops waiting to be photographed from a satellite and destroyed on demand. Iran's military planners are not amateurs. They spent decades watching how America fights, watching how the United States locates targets, tracks movements, coordinates strikes, and eliminates threats from the air. And they drew one central lesson from everything they observed: any asset visible from the sky is an asset already lost. So they went underground systematically, deliberately, over many years of construction. Anti-ship cruise missiles, including systems like the Noor, the Qader, and the Abu Mahdi, were stored inside tunnels bored directly into mountainsides along the Hormuz coastline, concealed behind camouflaged entrances, protected inside reinforced bunkers engineered to survive the kind of precision airstrikes that America used to eliminate surface threats in every conflict since the Gulf War. Mobile truck-mounted launchers could roll out of those tunnels, fire, and disappear back underground before any response aircraft could arrive on target. Fixed installations were buried deep enough that conventional bunker-busting munitions, even the most advanced ones in the American inventory at the time, lacked the penetrating power to reach the weapons stored inside. Iran's entire deterrence model rested on that depth, and for years that depth was enough. On March 17, 2026, U.S. Central Command posted on X, U.S. forces successfully employed multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions on hardened Iranian missile sites along Iran's coastline near the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles in these sites posed a risk to international shipping. in the Strait. Not against a Houthi proxy operating out of Yemen. Not a warning shot dropped into an empty patch of Iranian desert to signal displeasure directly onto Iranian soil, directly onto the very facilities Tehran had spent years and enormous resources constructing precisely because it believed they were permanently unreachable from the air. The weapon CENTCOM chose for this moment was the GBU-72 Advanced 5000 Penetrator, and if you do not know what that weapon is and what it does, you need to, because it is the single reason Iran's entire underground deterrence strategy collapsed in one night. The GBU-72, also known as the Advanced 5000 Penetrator, is a 5,000-pound precision-guided bunker-busting bomb that uses a JDAM guidance kit combining GPS positioning with inertial navigation for all-weather accuracy. It was developed specifically as a direct replacement for the GBU-28, the bunker buster that first entered service during the Gulf War in 1991 and has been in the American arsenal for over 30 years. The GBU-28 was never a bad weapon. In its time, it was genuinely remarkable, capable of punching through approximately 15 feet of reinforced concrete and around 150 feet of compacted earth before detonating. But the GBU-28 is 3 decades old, and for 3 full decades, America's adversaries have been building deeper, more reinforced, more sophisticated underground facilities designed with one specific purpose: to outlast it. The GBU-72 was engineered to make that entire underground arms race irrelevant in a single strike package. The GBU-72 is a precision-guided deep burial defeat weapon built for hardened and deeply buried targets. It uses GPS guidance and a high-explosive warhead optimized specifically for post-penetration detonation, meaning the bomb physically burrows through rock and concrete before it detonates, creating a confined internal blast. Rather than a surface explosion, the Air Force expects it to offer substantially higher lethality against deeply buried and fortified targets than any previous weapon in its class. Exactly how much deeper it penetrates compared to its predecessor remains classified, and that is not an oversight. That is a deliberate strategic choice. It is a message to every adversary on Earth with an underground military facility that they do not have complete information about what this weapon can actually do to their bunkers. Uncertainty itself becomes a deterrent. The use of the GBU-72 also preserves the American stockpile of the even more powerful GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the 3,000-pound weapon that requires a B-2 stealth bomber for delivery and is reserved specifically for the deepest, highest priority targets, including hardened nuclear facilities, for scenarios where it may still be needed later. But here is the detail about the GBU-72 that makes it truly devastating in operational practice, the part that sounds almost elegant once you fully understand the logic. You do not actually need to destroy every underground bunker to neutralize it completely. You do not need to reach the deepest point of every facility. You do not need to collapse every tunnel from the inside. You just need to seal it shut. Every underground facility on Earth, no matter how deep, no matter how reinforced, no matter how many years and how many billions it took to construct, requires surface access to function operationally: entry corridors, access tunnels, the points through which personnel move, equipment operates, fuel is delivered, and in Iran's specific case, the exits through which missile launchers must physically roll out to reach their above-ground firing positions. Collapse those tunnels, destroy those access points, seal those entry corridors, and whatever is stored inside becomes permanently irrelevant. The launcher cannot fire if it can never reach the surface. The carefully constructed fortress becomes a sealed vault. The years of construction, the billions spent, the doctrine built around invulnerability, all of it rendered useless without a single bomb needing to reach the deepest chamber. That is the precise strategy the United States executed along the Hormuz coastline on March 17. The war zone reported that the Hormuz strikes appear to mark the GBU-72E's true operational combat debut. Defense publication The Aviationist independently reached the same conclusion. However, a May 2024 report citing unnamed U.S. officials claimed the weapon may have already been deployed against Houthi underground positions in Yemen during their Red Sea shipping campaign. Sit with that for a moment, because the implication is staggering. The Houthis are not just any armed group. They are a direct Iranian proxy, armed, funded, trained, and strategically directed by Tehran. They were running their own blockade of a different global waterway, targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea in a campaign that mirrors almost exactly what Iran has been executing in the Strait of Hormuz. If those 2024 reports are accurate, Iran effectively received an advanced battlefield preview of this exact weapon through its own proxy forces. It watched what the GBU-72 did to Houthi underground positions. It analyzed the damage, it studied the results, and it still concluded that its coastal network along the Hormuz was built to a standard this bomb could not defeat. That conclusion cost Iran its entire coastal deterrence architecture in a single night. The GBU-72 is deployable from both the F-15E Strike Eagle and the B-1B Lancer bomber. The critical difference is payload. The B-1B can carry up to 12 GBU-72 munitions per aircraft, compared to the F-15E's single-weapon payload, with credible estimates suggesting close to 50 of these bombs were deployed. Across the Hormuz strike package, the arithmetic points clearly and unmistakably toward B-1B Lancers as the primary delivery platform for this operation. 4 B-1B Lancers, approximately 48 bombs, launched from a base over 8,000 kilometers from the target, flying over Iranian territory that Operation Epic Fury had already stripped of roughly 85% of its integrated air defense network through weeks of prior strikes. CENTCOM confirmed that the munitions penetrated layers of rock and concrete to destroy the underground bunkers holding the anti-ship missiles Iran had been positioning to threaten international shipping through the strait, a message delivered in 5,000-pound increments to a regime that staked its entire strategic leverage on the belief that its underground network was simply beyond the reach of American air power. The response from Tehran revealed a regime caught between public defiance it needed for domestic audiences and private recalculation it could not avoid. Following the strikes, President Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum: reopen the Strait of Hormuz to all international shipping or face strikes against Iran's domestic power infrastructure, the systems that keep electricity flowing across the entire country. Iranian officials publicly threatened retaliatory strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, explicitly naming Saudi Arabia and the UAE as potential targets, signaling that any further escalation would spread consequences across the entire region. But simultaneously, Tehran announced it would permit most commercial vessels to transit the strait, a sharp departure from the near-total blockade posture it had maintained for weeks. Genuine de-escalation or calculated tactical retreat. The shipping data moving through the strait in the days that followed would answer that question far more honestly than any official statement from either capital. On April 11th, Trump announced that American forces had started actively clearing the strait. Several U.S. Navy destroyers entered the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the war began 6 weeks earlier. A U.S. official described it as an operation focused on freedom of navigation through international waters. Then came a detail that captures just how badly Iran's Hormuz strategy had deteriorated. Iran had reportedly lost track of some of the mines it had planted in the strait, making it unable to fully reopen the waterway even when it wanted to. U.S. Central Command confirmed that underwater drones are being used in active mine clearing operations throughout the corridor. The U.S. Navy is not just blockading Iran from the outside, it is actively dismantling a minefield that Iran itself can no longer locate or control. That single fact tells you everything about the state of Iran's Hormuz leverage in April 2026. Now step back and connect the full timeline, because when you see it laid out together, the strategic picture becomes unmistakable. The GBU-72 strikes destroyed or sealed Iran's underground anti-ship missile sites on March 17th. Iran's top naval commander overseeing the blockade, Alireza Tangsiri, was killed by an Israeli airstrike on March 26th. Peace talks in Islamabad collapsed on April 12th after 21 hours of negotiations produced nothing. And within hours of that collapse, Trump posted on Truth Social, effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. He called Iran's position world extortion and warned that any Iranian who fires at American or peaceful vessels will be, in his exact words, blown to hell. The underground missiles that were supposed to deter this exact moment sealed in their tunnels. The naval command structure that was supposed to coordinate the Iranian response decapitated. The financial windfall from charging $2 million tolls to Chinese and Indian tankers gone the moment the U.S. blockade began. Iran's leverage did not erode gradually. It collapsed on 3 separate fronts simultaneously, and the GBU-72 strikes on March 17th were the first domino that made everything else possible. A senior NATO military official confirmed that the United Kingdom is leading planning efforts for a coalition of more than 40 nations to protect freedom of navigation in the strait, with assets from member nations already being pre-positioned in the region. This is no longer just an American operation. This is the international community, 40 nations aligned, moving to physically pry open a waterway that one country decided to hold hostage for its own strategic leverage. Every nation that depends on energy imports, every economy connected to global trade, every government that warned Washington for weeks to solve this problem is now moving toward active participation. One former senior naval commander described the blockade as a big task and a big gamble, but noted it places direct economic pressure on Tehran without destroying the oil infrastructure that any future Iranian government would need to rebuild the country. That distinction matters more than it might appear. This is not a strategy designed to erase Iran. It is pressure engineered specifically to change Iran's behavior while preserving the assets a post-regime Iran would need to recover. The 2-week ceasefire expires on April 22nd. No date, no location, and no format has been set for any next round of negotiations. Both delegations walked out of Islamabad blaming each other for the collapse. 10 days. That is the window remaining. 10 days for Iran's leadership to decide whether the strategic calculus has shifted enough, whether the sealed bunkers, the dead naval commander, the active naval blockade, and the 40-nation coalition bearing down on the strait represent a situation that demands a return to the table, or whether Tehran gambles on a military response against the most powerful combined naval force ever deployed in that region. Iran's chief negotiator Ghalibaf told reporters after leaving Islamabad, "The U.S. has understood Iran's logic and principles. It is time for them to decide whether they can earn our trust or not." That is not the language of a country preparing for full-scale war. That is the language of a country that has watched its leverage evaporate and is now searching, carefully and deliberately, for an exit that preserves some shred of dignity for its leadership. Here is the final picture and why every single detail in this breakdown matters for what comes next in the hours and days ahead. Iran spent years and enormous resources constructing an underground missile network it believed was permanently untouchable. It buried its most dangerous anti-ship weapons inside mountains. It designed its entire deterrence doctrine around one assumption that depth and reinforcement would defeat American air power indefinitely. It looked at that network and concluded it had found leverage that simply could not be answered from the sky. The GBU-72, built specifically to destroy deeply buried, heavily reinforced targets with GPS precision regardless of weather or visibility conditions, answered that assumption directly on March 17, 2026. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper stated clearly in the aftermath that U.S. forces remain focused on eliminating every remaining element of Iran's threat to free navigation, and that operations will not stop until those threats are permanently and completely removed. The Strait of Hormuz is not fully open yet. The ceasefire clock is ticking toward April 22nd. The blockade is active as of today. But the era of Iran believing it can hold the world's most critical energy corridor hostage without paying an overwhelming and irreversible strategic price, that era ended the moment the first GBU-72 penetrated Iranian rock on March 17th. If you want to stay ahead of every development as this moves toward its conclusion, you are in the right place. This is Global Alert Brief. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell, turn on every notification, because the next move in this conflict is coming fast, and you will not want to be the last person to understand what it means.